Good morning and welcome. It's good to have a group where we can actually engage with some of these issues, and I'm very aware of the fact that for most of us in Britain, apart from flooding, if you're built on a floodplain or have a stream at the bottom of your garden, for many of us water is something that we simply take for granted, but it's not actually that. Why are we doing this with something around the world? When I came to St Paul's, I was faced with a question about how do we get engaged with the wider world. And one of the thinkings was, we've had deans from other countries coming to St Paul's from time to time. Is there something we could do to bring cathedrals and churches together from around the world? St Paul's was known as the Cathedral of the Empire, and indeed at one stage in the 1950s we sent little bits of ourselves, bits of rubble, around the world. So you may have a cathedral near you which has a bit, if you're somewhere from else in the world, it somewhere has a bit of the Cathedral of St Paul's actually in it. There was that sense of family around the world which we had, which we want to not exactly recreate, but have a rather more adult approach to say, look, we are partners together in this enterprise of what it means to be the Church of God throughout the world, and how does the gospel affect the world in ways that we can work together on. Why are we doing this? Well, we share the same issues and challenges. We are all engaging with these things, and it seems to me that as churches and cathedrals around the world, how do we do that in a way that helps one another rather than reinventing the wheel in our own situation? There's a lot that we can learn from each other. And thirdly, we can be effective if we raise our voice together in terms of promoting change. And one of the things I've been concerned with the Institute is how we make sure that the Institute is not only doing awareness raising, but also producing change in the world. That's why we exist. That's why we want to see things happening around us. That's why we meet together. So how do we increase the element of social justice in the world through the work that we are doing? How do we do it together? And to be effective in what we're doing, we need to think about how we relate with business, with the common good, with ethical behaviour, and we're doing that in various ways in the Institute too. And particularly when politics is increasingly aiming to define us by our differences, by what divides us, by our boundaries, our ethnicity or our gender, we have to start with that sense of the creation that God makes of all humanity in one, and that we are together in Christ, and in the eyes of God we are equal. And it's very easy to lose sight of that in a Brexit and Trump-oriented world. And that seems to me where, as Christians around the world, we need to raise our voice to say that we stand in solidarity not only with other Christians, we're not just a tribe that sticks together, but we are here, as the Epistle to Diognetus put it in the 2nd century, as the priests for the world. We're here to enable the world to find the justice, compassion and love of God in what goes on inside it. Everyone is our neighbour. We celebrate the same liturgical calendar in the Anglican Communion around the world on the whole, but we're less good at sharing training, cost savings and programmes. Why? One reason is the Anglican structures. So we have dioceses in England. Even cathedrals, I have to tell you, in this country don't work together as much as we might. In fact, very little on areas of common interest, because we focus on serving our diocese rather than on the wider issues of our society. We do it from a particular perspective. But how might we as cathedrals in England work together on matters of common interest? Likewise, the nature of the structure of the Anglican Communion means it tends to work in provinces and through bishops rather than through programmes and what we're doing. Where there's a named network, it can be more successful, like the Anglican Communion Environmental Network, the Networks of Peace and Justice and others, and organisations like the Mothers' Union, for example, have been very effective in certain campaigns worldwide using their networks. And we can work together with other Christian or interfaith charities or civil society organisations when they work alongside us, whether it's Green Faith or Christian Aid or others. It's also difficult to know who shares your interests, and indeed who is. How do you know who the other people are around the world or engaged in these sorts of issues? Indeed, we find it quite difficult to just get an up-to-date list of clergy in the Diocese of London, let alone in the wider world. So how do we create networks within the church that allow us to find out what the interests are and how we can work together in common on those interests. And of course, we're all very busy serving our cathedrals, our parishes, our congregations. Many of you will have parishes to run which have very little support in what goes on. And you discover that your different worship communities have varying needs and interests. And it's how we do that locally which is key for us. How do we incarnate the gospel of Christ in our local context? But also, how do we nonetheless come together to ask the question about how Christ affects the life of a city, a society, a nation? We need to work on those things too. How do we avoid doing work that's replicated elsewhere? How do we work together to make us more effective in what we're doing both locally, socially and regionally and nationally? There's a lot of good work going on around how to do this in business schools, in professional organisations, in civil society. And how can we do this better from our own perspective? And where we started here at this cathedral was to ask, how can we harness our efforts at different levels to support each other, learn from each other, get economies of scale, and help to speed up change in order to promote justice in the world? So the Institute, when I said to them, look, it'll be good to do something on these lines, responded by saying, well, how do we do it? Looking at thematic work that would resonate with church communities around the world, and then looking for partners to represent the scale and scope of global cooperation, and then asking the question, how do we work together in order to achieve that? And what you see today, what we're discussing today, are the first fruits of that labour. Thematically, we were fairly certain that a topic around the environment or the Millennium Development Goals would have a broad appeal. And looking within the context of those, water was an obvious choice because it's essential to life. Following a rather interesting but somewhat unscientific poll, water tends to have largely happy and positive associations to most people. If you live by the sea or an area subject to flooding, that probably won't be the case. But when you think of going to the seaside, or the babbling of a running brook, or sparkling fountains, or relaxing in a bath, you think water has some quite positive connotations with it. Whereas global warming and climate change raise depressing and negative associations in relation to water that has got out of control. And indeed in this cathedral, we're looking at trying to double the capacity of our roofs to remove water in response to climate change and the intensity of rainfall, which has resulted already in the cathedral in certain parts being flooded in periods of intense rainfall. You also have theological topics around water, and there's a huge seam of those, of course, considering how basic water is to human life. Theological reflection on it too is very important, whether it's the parting of the Red Sea, the baptism of Christ and the baptism of Christian believers, the marriage at Cana, the Samaritan woman drawing water from the well, the water in the wound of Christ in John's account of the crucifixion. There are all sorts of ways in which water runs right through the scriptures, right down to the river of life that flows out of the temple in the visions of Ezekiel and John of Patmos. And beyond directly theological topics in terms of stewardship, every community in the world has some engagement with the question of water. When I was a kid, I did a study at school on how do we get our water. And I had no idea until I started poking around exactly what Thames Water got up to and how complex it was, drawing diagrams of pipe networks and all of that. And we simply sit and turn the tap on and expect it to happen. But actually, hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds and many decades of work have gone into that being a possible reality. You won't notice this on the video, but if you're sitting in this room, you may notice a very faint whiff of sewage. That's because Christopher Wren didn't actually build sewers in the cathedral, and the Victorians put some stuff in which aren't as effective as they might be. And it's something which is on our radar. But dealing with what comes in and what goes out in terms of water is a challenge for every institution, particularly ancient ones. And of course, many churches don't have water, don't have toilet facilities, find it very difficult to offer hospitality in relation to water. And the topic lends itself well to a multi-sector approach too. The United Nations has long sponsored World Water Day, and Barbara's mentioned the toilet twinning charity. Business is also increasingly aware of the need for clean water as part of its requirements, and also for the removal of waste. And some industries use huge amounts of water and require it to be there. How do you deal with that? If you're an investor, how do you make sure that issues around water have been thought about and engaged with in the companies which you're investing in, so they're not going to be subject to the vagaries of climate change, and indeed points at which the infrastructure that we've got used to may begin to break down in future when investment is not sufficient or when there are too many calls upon its use. Governments are looking at policies on clean beaches and flood protection. The question of whether land is going to be left to go back to the sea, left as water meadow, all the people that could affect. It's a matter of politics and economics. Do you have a blue flag for your beach or not? Is it a place where people feel safe to come? And also, as well as multi-sector approaches, we can have a multidisciplinary approach, which also engages artistic and scientific participation. And you can work with school children about water, not just about me sitting down trying to work out where the water comes from, but also doing things together which relate to our own cultural inheritance. Next year marks the 300th anniversary of Handel's Water Music, which of course is not the reason why we're looking at water as a matter of a theme, but it's a reminder of the way in which water is such an important part and a rich topic in our own societies, and societies right around the world. So how do we build partnerships in relation to this? Well, we began using here our existing connections with international churches and cathedrals to build cooperation. We've had a long-standing relationship with Trinity Church Wall Street in New York City, who are very interested. St Paul's Cathedral Melbourne contacted us and have been interested in setting up their own institute on the other side of the world, and so we're working together with them. And they're going to use this partnership as a means into building up the capacity of their own institute in that part of Australia. And we were glad to have Archbishop Thabo Magoba of Cape Town, formerly head of the Anglican Communion Network on the Environment, support our efforts in partnership with St George's Cathedral in Cape Town. And we're delighted to be working with Dean Michael Weeder there on this project. And so what we're looking to do now is to build out the network of churches and cathedrals involved in the project. The Just Water website is obviously a key way of doing that, enabling congregations and others to access resources and to get inspired about it. We're developing the Lenten study materials, which we hope will be useful for churches as we come round to that time of year. And information about charities engaged in the sector, which you may already be involved with and want to support in this particular aspect of their work. Second, the core participants are in the process of building their programmes too. Trinity Wall Street has a long history of an annual conference with simultaneous webcasting of events in different locations in order to broaden its reach. They're very ambitious kind of work. And this year they're going to be tackling water justice in their conference to be held around World Water Day. And historically, the people at Trinity Wall Street have managed to field questions from some of the remote locations around the world in order to make the conversation there global. And that's something we'll be looking to partner with together with them on that day. And as these programmes and materials build, we'll add them to the Just Water website so you can see what's going on and have access to what is happening. We'll be looking to video events and put them on the website, and also have specially commissioned videos and other work which will provide resources in this area. And all of us, hopefully, will be focusing our programming around World Water Day, which is on the 22nd of March 2017. At our most ambitious, we'll be trying to link up different sites in conversation. At the minimum, we'll be sharing the Twitter hashtag JustWater17 so we can have conversations around the world over the course of that day. And the Institute here will be continuing to run the programme throughout the year, in order to try and maximise its benefits and its impact. And at the conclusion of that work, there will be a single summary report. In this case, it will be a special edition of the Anglican Theological Review, a quarterly based in Chicago, which will be devoted to the issue of water, and that review will appear at the culmination of the programme at the beginning of 2018. How do we cooperate? Well, we've only begun to explore some of the potential, but some of the ideas are, for example, having a donations drive to coincide with the overall campaign to make a tangible difference. With the question, should we pick one global charity to support, or should we look at numerous local ones and encourage people to log what they've actually enabled to happen by what they've been doing? Second, what about having a volunteer drive to see how people who are inspired with the concept of water actually can put that into effect by being involved locally with charities? Third, having a competition for the best ideas for a water-saving or water access device. There are all sorts of potentials for crowdfunding and other things in inventions being brought forward. Are there things that we could do to inspire new ways of engaging positively with water? Having a photographic competition, which often inspires people's imagination and is accessible to many people around the world. It's something you could run not just for here, but for everywhere. And the challenge, how can everyone who participates make a difference, which is what we seek to do by having this programme at all. And some of the day later on will be spent on looking at other possibilities of how we can make this more of a reality. What about the challenges? Well, there are challenges for each location in developing its own programme on local needs, but also how to link that into an overarching approach that makes some kind of coherent sense in what we're trying to achieve. And there's always conflict too between a large, broad tent that encompasses everyone and a narrower one where objectives are clearer. How do you balance those things about a narrow, targeted objective and something which is about raising awareness and inspires people to do something around the world? In this particular programme, we're opting, from our perspective, for the broad tent, but we recognise the challenges of that and the challenge of helping people to engage locally in making that a reality. And also we recognise that there are varying levels of resources, both of time and energy and money, to commit to this. And finding outside funding for activities is difficult and time-consuming, and that's one of our challenges. And also, when you're doing something around the world, how do you find a time when everybody is awake? Which is also rather a logistical nightmare. Or do you set your alarm clock for 3 o'clock in the morning so you can talk to Australia? Well, what about the future? This is a first go for us at this type of international cooperation, and it's a bit of an experiment. But you've got to start somewhere. It's ambitious, but it's difficult to do something global without being ambitious. So let's try it and see how we go. We'll do a review of this project when we get to the end of it, consider what we've learned and how we might be able to take this further in relation both to water as an issue and to other issues which we and partners around the world think are important to draw to the world's attention. Because that's what we're trying to do, actually to say to the world, look, this is an area which some people live and die by. I mean, if you're living out in a semi-arid area, water is your survival. In our society, we take it for granted, as with other issues around the world. So how can we, for whom this doesn't seem to be much of an issue on the whole, take on board that for much of the human race, water is a key question, and indeed maybe a key flashpoint of conflicts around the world in the years to come, as is beginning to happen in some places. So we're going to ask you for your reactions. What do you think about this? What would you like to see projects like this doing in future? What do you feel that you need that's not already well provided for elsewhere, so we can continue to fashion programmes which are interesting and relevant to what you're doing? And thank you very much for being interested and relevant enough to come along today, and we look forward to working together with you. Thank you.